On July the 7th, 2005, London was changed forever.
People have said different things, like they've said that the bombs that were on the train could not have done the damage, that they, as described, the bombs in rucksacks could not have done the damage that was evident on the day. So those bombs must have already been there on the train or underneath the train.
This week on The Big Story, as the family and friends of those killed on the fateful day continue to demand an open and full investigation into what happened, we ask, why do questions remain?
After, having done a lot of research on the 9/11 issue, I came to the conclusion that you can't trust the intelligence services.
They felt like they've got the captors, put them away, case closed, move on.
July 7th, 2005. In London there was panic, fear, and the dawning realization that something terrible had happened. There had been reports of explosions going off on London's tube network. Multiple casualties had been reported, and a terrified city was trying to make sense of the chaos. 5 years later, and the sheer panic that gripped London is shockingly easy to recall. Do you remember what you were doing when the news of 7/7 broke?
Yeah, I think I was at work actually, and there was a massive confusion, and it was just crazy. Reports were coming through from friends. People were calling me up, making sure where I was, because it's actually the station that I come to every day to go to work.
It was a horrific day because no one knew what was happening. Regardless, even though I worked for a large news organization, no one quite knew what was happening in the city. So I just wanted to get outside on foot. I didn't feel safe anywhere.
I personally remember frantically trying to get hold of members of my own family. A sketchy news report hinted at a catastrophe. Relatives from abroad desperately scrambled for news as London's emergency response services creaked under the weight of the city's fear. Official reports gave conflicting information. The explosions that had rocked trains just outside Liverpool Street and Edgware Road stations and the tunnel between King's Cross and Russell Square were at first described as electrical surges, to calm, we think, an increasingly frantic public. When a number 30 bus exploded in Tavistock Square, it became clear simple explanations would not suffice. It would be weeks before 56 people, including the 4 alleged suicide bombers, were confirmed dead. Over 750 people were injured. Most Brits have an idea of what they think happened that fateful July morning. 3 bombers detonated explosives on 3 underground stations, and a 4th, overcome by the confusion caused by the earlier blast, boarded a bus when the final bomb was detonated. For the passengers on the Piccadilly line train on July the 7th, it would have been a London day like any other, summer's one just like this on the way into work. Unbeknownst to them, however, 2 explosions had rocked separate stations on the London Underground. And barely 500 metres in from King's Cross Station, that Piccadilly line train too suffered a horrific explosion that rocked the rear of the first carriage, causing a massive impact to the carriage itself and to the surrounding tunnel. The train never made it to its next destination, which would have been Russell Square Station right here. One could only imagine the horror on that carriage. One could only imagine the horror of that day. That horror was brought home to novelist and journalist Vanessa Walters. Her childhood friend and flatmate, Christian Small, was one of the 26 people to die on the Piccadilly line explosion.
I was there when the police officers came round to say that they found Christian. And that was a really bad day. I think that was about a week later.
So 7 days?
It was at least 7 days. It could have been 10 days. I can't remember exactly, but it was at least 7 days. Because, there was not a lot of information coming out. When you went to King's Cross, it was all cordoned off. They wouldn't let anyone, they wouldn't talk to anyone, they wouldn't let anyone in. And it was just a question of, I guess we'll let you know. And then eventually they just...
Were you hoping at that stage, Vanessa, that?
I think I knew he was gone, and I think I knew he was gone because I wrote a poem about his passing, and I definitely felt, I think it was like the 5th day, I felt like his spirit came home. And I wrote a poem about that because I felt it very strongly. I felt like he was gone.
Vanessa is just one of the many friends and family members who, 5 years on, are trying to piece together the full picture of what happened to their loved ones on that day.
There's been so much said about a public inquiry and who should be a part of that and what it should try and uncover. Do you have any ideas or thoughts about what you think should happen?
I definitely think we haven't got the full story. I don't know what... I can't even get my head around what are the specific things that I have an issue with in terms of where the holes are. But people have said different things, like they've said that the bombs that were on the train could not have done the damage that they, as described, the bombs in rucksacks could not have done the damage that was evident on the day. So those bombs must have already been there on the train or underneath the train. People have said that these people who supposedly did the attacks, they were perhaps set up. I don't know. And perhaps there is something more to be said about these events. I don't think we'll ever really know the full story. I don't know. Obviously, I think there need to be more answers. I think that, you know, the government's understanding of terrorism and who commits terrorism and where the dangers are, I think that is, you know, I think that's oversimplified, you know, for political objectives. That's my own reasoning. I'm a questioning person, but I couldn't tell you exactly where I think the holes are.
Many of the families have taken to the British courts in an attempt to get definitive answers around the tragedy of July 7th. There's still not been a public inquiry into the events surrounding the most deadly act of domestic terrorism on mainland Britain. Law firms like Uri Clark represent many of the families who've had to go down the legal route in an effort to lift the veil on the events that the former Met Police Commissioner Sir Ian Blair described as the largest criminal inquiry in English history. Many people seem to think that there's already been an open and full inquiry.
Does it surprise you that 5 years after the event there still hasn't been a public inquiry into what happened?
Quite surprising. I'm surprised to even say that. I didn't realize there hasn't been a public inquiry.
Does it surprise you that 5 years on there still hasn't been a public inquiry, a public open inquiry?
Yeah, it's very surprising, because it was such a big event in the history, basically, of the UK, you could say, you know.
I guess they felt like they've got the captors, put them away, case closed, move on. And I think we all realize that there's lots of other instances that we don't even know about.
And the government hadn't got the act together. I mean, the last government didn't do it. I'm not sure if the new government is going to do it. I think there's a lot of answers. There's a lot of questions that need to be answered. A lot of people are very angry that they don't really know the truth, really what happened, you know. So I'm very disappointed, actually.
But why the need for further investigation? Surely 7/7 is an open and shut case, right? Not for everyone. According to all official accounts, 4 British Muslims, Mohammed Siddiqui Khan, Shehzad Tanweer, Jermaine Lindsay and Hasib Mir Hussein planned and executed their attacks on London. Tony Gosling is a journalist and one of the many voices to question the official explanation put forward about those attacks.
Tony, what have we learned since 7/7?
I think one of the most important things about the London bombings is that much evidence has come out since that actually disproves the original version of events. Now, if you remember, at the time, we were told who had committed these horrendous crimes.
Very quickly, we saw CCTV footage, we saw these men with the very famous gym rucksacks,
Well, we
and
saw
we were given a timeline.
We saw some CCTV footage.
Yeah.
We saw CCTV of them at Luton and one or two stills of them coming close to the London Underground transport network. But actually, what's happened since is loads of evidence has come out to contradict the original story. And let's not forget, the original story was simply told to us at a press conference by Sir Ian Blair, who was Chief Constable of the Metropolitan Police at the time. Now, as far as I'm concerned, that is not enough. We need to have some sort of proper inquiry. There have been a few investigations by mainstream media and newspapers into this, but I think one of the most important points is that whilst we have seen some pictures of CCTV, we have seen no pictures that actually put those 4 guys, alleged bombers, on the same 4 trains that day. And if you go into anywhere on the London Underground network, you'll see cameras everywhere. Cameras on the trains, cameras on the platforms, and also in the escalators as people are going down. So you would have thought that some of that should have been come out.
The lack of CCTV footage of the alleged bombers on the day of the attacks is just one of a string of unanswered questions. There have only been 2 full images of one or all the bombers on the day of the attacks released. From the hundreds of cameras on London's transport network, only 2 images have ever seen the light of day. This one apparently shows the alleged bombers entering Luton train station on the morning of the attacks. This one, released 3 months later, apparently shows Hasib Hussein leaving a shop in King's Cross before the last bomb exploded on the number 30 bus. This later picture mysteriously has no timestamp, meaning it could have been taken at any time. There is no footage of the men arriving in London, no footage of the men boarding the trains, no footage of Hasib Hussein walking around London for an hour before the bus explosion, except the one without a timestamp outside a shop in King's Cross. Another anomaly in the official story families of those who were killed would like clarified is which train the alleged bombers took to London on July the 7th, or indeed whether they could have made it to London in time to set the bombs off at all. It was initially stated by the police that the men got the 7:40 train from Luton. However, a year later, a witness who was at Luton train station that morning said the 7:40 train had been cancelled that day.
About a year afterwards, in fact, on the 11th of July 2006, the then Home Secretary John Reid stood up in the House of Commons to tell MPs, well, we're very sorry, but we got the time of the train that the alleged bombers took from Luton to London wrong.
Other reports stated that the alleged bombers got the 7:48 train, which should have got to London at 8:20. However, as well as the 7:40 being cancelled, all other trains were delayed that day. This is a timetable released to researchers by rail service employees.
How on earth can there have been a proper police investigation into these attacks if they got the wrong time of a train that the bombers took, and that train indeed was shown to have been cancelled that day? I think that's evidence that there was no original proper police investigation into the attack.
Why does any of this matter? Well, the police say they have CCTV footage which they refuse to release to the public of the alleged bombers at King's Cross Station at 8:26. On any normal day, if the men had got the 7:40 or the 7:48 train, they would have arrived well before 8:26. But not on the 7th of July, as this timetable proves. Perhaps they got the 7:16 or the 7:20 train. Impossible. Remember the first CCTV photo of the men at Luton train station? The timestamp says 7:21 and 54 seconds. This means those trains had already left before they got to the station. The last option is the 7:24. This got to King's Cross at 8:23, only 3 minutes before the CCTV footage the police say they have of the men at King's Cross. However, it takes closer to 7 minutes to walk from the train station to where the CCTV footage is said to have been taken in the tube station.
We're in Tavistock Square, a picturesque area of central London that was also the scene for the 4th bomb, the bomb that exploded on the number 30 bus. Just being here, being in this space, it is so difficult to imagine that people just wandering around would not have been aware of what took place here 5 years ago. the utter carnage and the historical significance.
Questions have also arisen about the fourth bomb, the one that destroyed the number 30 bus in Tavistock Square. The 4 cameras on the bus were mysteriously not working that day. A police source said,
"We don't know if the driver forgot to switch them on, or if there was a technical problem, but there are no images."
When asked a few days after the attack, Hazel Blair's, a Labour minister at the time, said more footage had not been released due to an ongoing police investigation. 5 years on, still no footage has been released. Daniel Obachike, a passenger on the ill-fated bus, wrote a book about his experiences called The Fourth Bomb. He has categorically claimed that the man he saw plant a suspicious bag near the blast area was not the Asian Hasib Hussein. Despite the hyper-publicity and interest that surrounds the July 7th attacks, there is still a public lack of witnesses to place any of the suspected bombers in the vicinity of their attacks. There are also reported inconsistencies in what eyewitnesses reported on the damage done by the bombs.
The other thing is there are various witnesses that say that the bombs were actually underneath the trains rather than in the trains.
Bruce Late, a victim of the Aldgate station bombings, was interviewed by the Cambridge Evening News after the explosion and told a very different story to the official version.
The policeman said, "Mind that hole, that's where the bomb was." The metal was pushed upwards as if the bomb was underneath the train. They seemed to think the bomb was left in a bag, but I don't remember anyone being where the bomb was or any bag.
His testimony is far from an isolated case.
We're in London's vibrant Portobello Road area, and you might be wondering what links fair trade coffee to questions about the 7/7 bombings. Well, meet the common link, Ian Henschel.
Henschel, the Oxford-educated businessman, runs a successful coffee shop in trendy Portobello Road. He's also a journalist and the author of 9/11 Revealed, challenging the facts behind the war on terror.
Walk into the shop, I order a mocha, do I get a little bit of history and facts with my coffee?
You will if I serve you.
Seems a bit weird, a Daily Mail piece in the middle of a fair trade coffee shop.
Yeah, well, the Daily Mail, of course, they do have an angle of, questioning and being very anti-government, anti-state. And this was actually their books editor
so
who
this was your
persuaded
piece?
them. Yeah, this was all about my book, my first book. And they gave it 3-4 pages in the Daily Mail. And it was, pretty famous. It was on sale at all the airport bookshops all across the world. And then the US State Department brought out a special page on their website to denounce my book.
That must have been quite...
Well, and everybody said, well, that'll be good.
Though.
It was flattering.
What were your initial thoughts?
My initial thoughts were, I don't believe anything any longer. I wonder what the truth of this is. That's very different from my initial thoughts after 9/11, when I was, like most people, I initially just inherently believed the media. But after, having done a lot of research on the 9/11 issue, I came to the conclusion that you can't trust the intelligence services to tell you the truth. Initially, they said that high-grade, sophisticated military explosives were used. And not only that, but they also told us at the time that they'd involved experts from France, experts from abroad, and this was what the experts had together decided.
A number of reports after the attacks by American, Canadian and Irish news sources alluded to high-grade explosives being used. Official sources concurred. Superintendent Christophe Chabou, head of the French Security Service Anti-Terror Coordination Unit, said the use of military explosives is very worrying. At a news conference on Saturday, July 9th, Scotland Yard Deputy Assistant Commissioner Brian Paddock said,
"All we are saying is that it is high explosives. That would tend to suggest that it is not homemade explosive. Whether it is military explosive, whether it is commercial explosive, whether it is plastic explosive, we do not want to say at this stage."
However, not long after these reports surfaced, the mention of high explosives suddenly stopped.
And then, just like that, with no explanation, the story just changed overnight. And as a person who obviously has to take an interest in the media, I can tell you exactly when it changed. Suddenly, one morning, the Guardian newspaper and the Independent newspaper, two newspapers which are very widely trusted, both announced based on unnamed sources that the story had now completely changed. They didn't say, oh, we're announcing the story's changed, but they just changed it. They said, we now know that these guys did it all in their home, you know, they cooked up the so-called explosives out of stuff they brought from a chemist. No explanation for why the story had changed, no official announcement. You know, they didn't even get the Scotland Yard guy out there saying, well, we've changed the story, we've got new evidence.
Why do you think a public inquiry is being stalled as you see it?
Well, in any normal sort of situation like this, you would expect there to be a proper public inquiry. If there is a single suspicious death, what we get is an inquest. If there are multiple suspicious deaths, as in this case, you would expect immediately a public inquiry to be instituted. That means that you don't have to have separate inquests where people have to give evidence again and again, and it's the quickest and most sensible resolution. But in this case, there has been constant stalling from the highest points of the establishment of a public inquiry, and I think that suggests a cover-up.
After years of struggle, the families and friends of the injured and the dead have scored a small victory. In May of this year, a coroner ordered a limited inquest into the 7/7 attacks, which will take place in the autumn of 2010. Some family members and survivors are upset at the scope of the inquest, as it would only examine the alleged failings of MI5 in the run-up to the attacks. When contacted by The Big Story, a Home Office spokesperson said,
"The government welcomes the coroner's decision. We hope that the inquest will allow the families of the victims to get to the bottom of the tragic events of the 7th July 2005.
There was no comment from the Home Office on why, 5 years later, a full and public inquiry was not forthcoming. The sheer weight of inconsistencies makes a mockery of Sir Ian Blair's assessment that the investigation into 7/7 would be the largest criminal investigation in the country's history. The job of cross-checking information that's been presented as evidence, as well as asking some of those difficult questions, this has fallen not to the authorities and some of those big media organizations, but to independent journalists who have highlighted some of the issues we flagged up in this program. These lapses are even more shocking when you consider the role the London bombings played in Britain's continuance of the so-called war on terror. The dying and the dead on the streets of London was a turning point for many Britons who saw terrorism not as an abstract thought, but as something that had come to their very doors.
Why is this so close to your heart?
Well, it's so close to my heart because I think this is something which many people think is a kind of racist, part of a racist attack on Islam in Britain. It's an excuse for extremist groups to peddle hate material about Muslims, and I think we need to actually, if we're going to be doing that kind of thing, we need to be absolutely sure about who carried out these bombings.
Whether cock-up or conspiracy, it's obvious that the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth about July the 7th has not been revealed.
I guess, you know, I don't really know what to make of the 7/7 attacks. I don't really know what to make of 9/11. You just have to get back to your life eventually.
Do you harbour any hatred towards the men who were said to have done this?
It does bring it home to you, the devastation that is caused by terrorism, by bombings, by war. And people are dying on both sides of the coin because it's not, you know, I don't necessarily know what I do understand about the whole idea of terrorism, but, you know, people are dying on both sides of the coin, and it's about not demonizing necessarily one side. It's about finding a way that we can all be tolerant of each other and we can all coexist with the same fundamental human rights. So I don't think it's about hatred, but I would say that I definitely understand now how, to some extent, how it feels. I mean, I'm not Christian's family, you know, and unlike Christian, I've been able to move forward. I've been able to get married. I've been able to, you know, start a family. These are things he won't get to do. And every year the further I go, the more I look back and see, wow, he went so young and he didn't get to do all of these great things I'm getting to do. And his family have to live with that every single day. So I definitely feel like some people feel it much more than me. Maybe they would feel hatred.